So that male wasps go not to get nectar or anything. They go to have sex with the orchids, and then they go from one orchid to another. So for them, it's the same kind of destruction of the family and the couple. It's an image of these wasps. Wasp fucking orchids and serial fucking orchids is a kind of image like cruising or anonymous sex, precisely as a negative attack on the couple and the closure in the couple, closure in the family. Here's a different one, appeal to different people with this sort of thing, I suppose, which is, by this notion, we would think about love of neighbor as an expansive social conception, one that's not limited by identity or even by proximity. Love in this sense is a socially constructive force. So what I'm thinking of for this is a passage in Franz Rosenzweig's mysterious book, The Star of Redemption. And what Rosenzweig's reading Leviticus here, where the notion of the mandate to the love of neighbor first appears. And Rosenzweig says that the neighbor in this passage is really just a placeholder. The love of neighbor has to be read not as love of the one next to you, but rather as an open space that extends potentially to all others. This there's other ways of doing this. You could talk about what seems to me a love of difference or a ethics of alterity characteristic of a certain Jewish theology. Levinas you could add to this, for instance. But this notion of love of neighbor now, not as love of the same, but precisely that of love of difference, openness to difference. Here, another one you could go with, but I think this is partly what I'm going to do today too, is there's a little bit of a scattershot method. So if certain things don't appeal to you, which I'm sure many of them won't, wait for the next one, because maybe it'll get closer to what you're interested in. I was thinking Walt Whitman would be the other example of this. Whitman often writes about the love of the stranger, and that it's precisely like on the Brooklyn Ferry or other times that's exactly the love that Whitman affirms, is that love that isn't closed in the couple, but the love of the mysterious one that's next to you. Okay, so that was then that was number one, which is that love is destroyed as a political concept by being closed within identity, love of the same, and would function as a political concept by being opened up to otherness, being an open social concept that extends beyond that. The second way in which love is destroyed as a political concept is the segregation of eros and agape, which you could also think about slightly differently as a segregation between the personal and the political. So on the one hand, we have love as only eros. That seems to me actually the most common in the culture that doesn't require explanation. Again, if you think about Hollywood films, when you think about love, it's a question of eros. Love as only agape, so agape, should I explain where the two, eros and agape, it functions a lot in Christian theology, especially about the writing about Paul's epistles, because Paul does not use the more common Greek word eros that Plato uses, of course. Paul uses a rather unusual Greek word, agape, so that often in which plays then a very fundamental role in certain strains of Christian theology of differentiating between eros and agape within the theological tradition. But here, let me give you an example, if agape doesn't firstly relate to you. An example would be, well, you could say priests in general are preaching often, or maybe you had different priests than I did, love as only agape and the exclusion of eros. The classic or most developed example, it seems to me, would be Augustine of Hippo, St. Augustine, who argues that we must denounce love as appetites and cupiditas, as desire, romantic love, in order to celebrate love as caritas. And he associates desire, cupiditas, that form of love, eros, with servitude and insecurity. In other words, servitude to the object of desire, insecurity in the possibility of losing it, whereas only caritas, which passes through the love of God, is the sign of freedom for Augustine. This is the essence of the distinction. In other words, in order to preserve love from craving and need, we need to affirm love as freely given, which is the love of God in both senses for Augustine. Our love for God and God's love for us. And so this would be love as only agape, and then the refusal or its distinction from eros. Let me give you then two, what seem to me, false claims to unify eros and agape. one from Freud and one from the Pope, B16, Ratzinger. This is the current Pope. So Freud, I'm thinking of a passage in group psychology and the analysis of the ego, where Freud writes what I think is exactly right. I should take a little bit of a, it's unusual for me, and almost all of you or all of you don't know me, to talk about both psychoanalysis and about theology. And I'm not the right person to do it, because on the one hand, I don't believe in the unconscious, and I also don't believe in God. So both of them are kind of violations, so I'm sort of on the bad terrain. And I don't know which one irritates the practitioners or faithful more, but anyway, I read things, so I'll report to you. So Freud notes in group psychology and analysis of the ego, he says that it's interesting how various kinds and various disparate relationships are covered by the term love, which is, I think, exactly right. This is partly what I'm trying to get at. So he says self-love, love of parents for children, sexual love, love of humanity, Plato's eros, Paul's agape, these are all covered by our notion of love. But this isn't the problem, Freud says. On the contrary, and now I'll quote Freud, he says, we, Freud, are of the opinion then that language has carried out an infinitely justifiable piece of unification in creating the word love with all its numerous uses. And that I agree with so far. The thing is, though, that Freud then makes clear that these are all united because libido is the foundation of all of them. Sexual desires, of course, are the direct result of libido for Freud, but also the formation of groups, society, and civilization itself are also results of a libido, secondary, often diverted results. So for Freud, in other words, eros and agape are united, so agape here could fit as that love of humanity, for instance, which is very close to the love of God in that Christian tradition. Eros and agape are united because agape, along with the other notions of love, is really subsumed under eros. Agape is really only eros repressed and sublimated. The current Pope makes exactly the opposite argument. He too says that eros and agape are united. He says, yet eros and agape, this is, by the way, an encyclical that was published about a year and a half ago called God is Love. And so the first encyclical that the current Pope published. So he says, yet eros and agape, ascending love, eros ascending towards God, and descending love, agape descending from God, can never be completely separated, the Pope writes. The more the two, in their different aspects, find a proper unity in the one reality of love, the more the true nature of love in general is realized. And that's where I'm trying to go to, in a way. It's this, then, he continues and say that eros needs to be disciplined and purified if it's to provide not just fleeting pleasure. And he continues, from the standpoint of creation, eros directs man towards marriage, to a bond which is unique and definitive, and thus, and only thus, does it fulfill its deepest purpose. Corresponding to the image of a monotheistic God is a monogamous marriage. Marriage based on exclusive and definitive love becomes the icon of the relationship between God and his people and vice versa. God's way of loving becomes the measure of human love. In other words, or this is my translation of it, agape subsumes eros. Eros is only legitimate insofar as it is under the sign or dominion of agape. So it seems to me that Freud and the Pope are doing exactly the opposite operation. They're uniting eros and agape, but under the dominion of one or the other. There are many, though, on the contrary, attempts or calls for, it seems to me, a different kind of unification of eros and agape. Deleuze and Guattari on desire, for instance, are trying to do something like that when they talk about desiring machines being both psychic and social. I'm more interested now in a series of books or writings that might be classified under feminists of color think love. So I'm thinking of people like Cherry Moraga, Chela Sandoval, Rosemary Hennessy, even if she isn't a feminist of color, and then Bell Hooks. So I don't even have to read the quotes from Bell Hooks. It's really just arguing that any political movement has to be based on what she calls a love ethic, that it's love in communities that sustains political action, not individualist or family love.